I was asked to share some thoughts on the new DSM-5 in the age of neuroplasticity. My initial thought was not about the DSM at all, but rather that the threshold for declaring something an age, an era, or an epoch is fairly low these days. Neuroplasticity is a term that is much in common with diagnoses. It is a metaphor. It might be contrasted with the idea that brains are hardwired. It hints at something wondrous, scientific, and new. It wasn't that long ago that plastic was the wondrous new malleable synthetic material that would solve all manner of problems, a product of science. Like bipolar 2, ADHD, PTSD, etc., neuroplasticity is a new word, an amalgam of two modern words for something that is not actually that new, an idea that hints at some kind of special knowledge. In my view, good mental health professionals have long appreciated that people can change, that all is not fixed or hardwired from birth or childhood. Why would we bother talking to people if we thought that people were essentially hardwired? We have a new word, and we think we have a new fact. I'm not suggesting the concept of neuroplasticity is not useful, but like psychiatric diagnoses, it is poorly defined. The introduction to Towards a Theory of Neuroplasticity states, given the central importance of neuroplasticity, an outsider would be forgiven for assuming that it was a well-defined, and that a basic and universal framework served to direct current and future hypotheses and experimentation. Sadly, however, this is not the case. Whilst many neuroscientists use the word neuroplasticity as an umbrella term, it means different things to different researchers in different subfields. In brief, a mutually agreed upon framework does not appear to exist. What we do know about plastic now is that its wholesale embrace had disastrous unintended consequences, much like diagnoses. It is highly toxic to the environment. I and many others have argued that there are potentially toxic consequences of diagnoses. The iatrogenic harm of psychiatric drugs, the stigma associated with particular diagnoses, and importantly the foreclosure of exploration of actual causes of problems that arise from treating diagnoses as actual diseases. That the brain changes as a consequence of taking drugs is an uncomfortable truth, one that you might be pleased to know I'm not going to labour, but would draw your attention to Robert Whittaker's book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, which in my view has more profound implications for us than Norman Doidge's The Brain That Changes Itself. Indeed, it rests on some of the same observations. Brains can change, and they do change when the possessor takes psychoactive substances. This, of course, can be good, but it can also be very bad, and there are far-reaching consequences. It does not, however, say anything about what might cause those things called disorders. Today I'm going to make some critical comments about the DSM-5 and the development of the diagnostic manuals generally. I'm going to argue that the catalogue of disorders are largely constructs of convenience rather than products of science, and that a clear, if not intentioned, consequence of these manuals is the medicalisation of everyday life, and the pharmaceutical industry is the main beneficiary. As a critic of this round, I'm in esteemed company. No longer are people critical of the manual, typically regarded as fringe-dwelling anti-psychiatry types, out of tune with the suffering of mad people and disengaged entirely from the real world, and in particular the coalface of mental health care. With this iteration of the DSM, the editorial columns of most psychiatric journals have included commentary highly critical of either the need for a new edition, the process of revision, or of the validity of diagnostic formularies generally. Organisations such as the American Psychiatric Association have made lengthy critical submissions, as have interest groups concerned that their disorder will be changed and thus limiting access to benefits. To my knowledge, nursing groups have been fairly quiet. To our collective shame, we are the least likely group to collectively criticise the dominant orthodoxy, whatever that might be. The DSM is, of course, highly symbolic of the psychiatricisation of everyday life, which is illustrated by the burgeoning number of categories of disorder which can be measured in inches of print in the DSM. When I ask a group of students who has taken a psychiatric drug or knows someone that has, most people's hands go up. In this country, there doesn't seem to be any particular reticence or shame associated with such declarations, and this is a good thing. The encroachment of medicine into corners of our lives, previously the purview of priests, counsellors and the like, may not directly affect us in the mental health workforce, working largely as we do with people with the more serious, functionally impaired and complex of presentations. In the last week, for example, few of us are likely to have worked with people with an Axis 1 diagnosis of dyspareunia, or pain associated with sexual intercourse. We deal largely with low prevalence problems, bipolar 1, the schizophrenias, anorexia nervosa, and the serious end of the post-traumatic depressive, substance-dependent, and anxiety spectrums. Nevertheless, this psychiatricization of everyday life is growing at a staggering rate. Over a quarter of all adults in the US are currently taking a psychotropic drug, and in 2010, Americans spent $16.1 billion on antipsychotics, the indications of which are now extended for depression, bipolar disorder, as well as schizophrenia. $11.6 billion was spent on antidepressants and $7.2 billion on the treatment for ADHD. We haven't even begun to account for other high prevalence mental disorders and the expensive pharmacopoeia of remedies for 302.72 male erectile disorder, which apparently affects 52% of adult males, or 302.72 female sexual desire disorder. I won't even speculate about the number of people affected. These figures are also only for insured people. Disturbingly, over $2 billion is spent each year on drugging the poorest children, those impoverished or in state care and entitled to Medicaid. The majority of drugs prescribed are for off-label indications, and their prescription constitutes fraud in the US. For example, no anticonvulsants masquerading as mood stabilizers have been approved by the FDA. Neither have Seroquel or Zyprexa, but these are routinely prescribed, generally in combination, so that most children in state care in the US are on a cocktail of psychotropic drugs. Indeed, 76% of the Medicaid budget for foster children is spent on psychiatric medication. Oh, those North Americans. We're not like that here in Australia. In Australia, expenditure on PBS psychotropics, that is not the hospital or tertiary mental health spend, accounted for $770 million, or $35 per Australian in 2010. 3/4 of these prescriptions were by general practitioners. In 2009-10, there were a staggering 29 million prescriptions filled in Australia for mental health related medications. Antidepressant medication accounted for 60% of the spend, or 13 million prescriptions. You do the math on the number of consultations this might represent and the cost to Medicare. I state this to illustrate our wholesale embrace of pharmacological treatments for all manner of problems. This is directly related to the expansion of the DSM in my view, a point I'll return to shortly. North American conceptions of mental health and illness have been embraced by the rest of the Western world, just as McDonald's, Coca-Cola and the iPhone have been. This edition of the DSM-5, which will be released in May 2013, has been marketed like no other. It ought to be. The APA will have made $100 million from the sales of the DSM when it is finally published. According to the APA site, it is one of the most anticipated events in the mental health field, made all the more tantalizing by the slow but steady trickle of information released about new disorders, proposed criteria, and the illusion that you too can meaningfully contribute. Apparently they've received over 8,000 comments, which seems quite high, but is rather perplexing when the site also claims that the APA represents 36,000 leading clinicians in the mental health field. Presumably most don't have much to say. 8,000 comments is quite a lot, but not particularly when one thinks about the public's fascination with madness, and that at least a quarter of all Americans are being treated with psychotropics. Maybe I expect a bit more. They also claim to have received over 50 million hits on their website. Quite a lot. But when Charlie Sheen tweeted, "I am on a drug and it's called Charlie Sheen," 1 million people joined up to follow him in 24 hours. 500 million people have watched Justin Bieber's music video Baby. And my favourite, 437 million people watched Charlie Bit My Finger Again.
Charlie bit me. Ah! Ah! Oh! Ouch! Ouch! Ouch, Charlie! Ow! Charlie! That really hurts! No, Charlie bit me.
885,000 people liked it, and 700,000 people commented on it. Thus far, 87 times the number of people commented on this classic video than the DSM-5. Not exactly science, I know, but it's about as scientific as much of the process of this revision, and I want to put paid to the notion that the development of the DSM-5 is a work of science. For a start, this edition is to represent a paradigmatic shift in the way mental health disorder is conceived, with an emphasis on dimensions rather than categories. Great so far, I'm all for that, but just because I am, or 160 people are, doesn't make it scientific. My reading of Thomas Kuhn is that paradigm shifts don't happen because a small group declare them into existence. Scientific revolutions are not a product of marketing hype. Because this is to be a radically new approach to classification, those that played a prominent role in the development of earlier editions were excluded. What has this got to do with scientific process? Announce that it's going to be radically different, appoint 160 experts in 13 subgroups, and exclude other people because they already had a turn. Charlie bit my finger again. Dr. Francis, who edited the DSM-4, was understandably miffed and has been stridently critical of most aspects of DSM-5 development process. He has also actually come out as one of the most erudite critics of diagnosis itself, and he is qualified to comment. He wrote the book. He states, "They are constructs we've made up, and often not very compelling ones at that. It has, for example, become clear that there is no one prototype schizophrenia waiting to be explained with one incisive and sweeping biological model. There is no gene or small subset of genes for schizophrenia. As Blurler intuited, schizophrenia is rather a group of disorders, or perhaps better, a mob. There may eventually turn out to be 20 or 50 or 200 kinds of schizophrenia. As it stands now, the definition and boundaries of schizophrenia are necessarily arbitrary. There is no clear right way to diagnose this gang, and not even much agreement on what the validators should be and how they should be applied. The first umpire was called out on strikes when the holy grail of finding the cause of schizophrenia turned out to be a wild goose chase." He also states, generally of mental disorders, "Alas, I've read dozens of definitions of mental disorder and helped to write one, and I can't say that they have the slightest value whatever." This is fairly scathing criticism indeed. Lloyd Sederer, APA member, spokesperson, medical director of New York State Office of Mental Health, and frequent Huffington Post blogger, conceded that Dr. Francis made some valid points. He stated, "The APA was trumped for a while in communications about the DSM by experienced experts, Dr. Alan Francis. His initial critique left the APA looking flat-footed about what it was going to do to make things right." He goes on, "These are serious issues, but they are not being ignored. Time will tell if they have been properly corrected. The DSM-5 development process has been less than perfect. The final DSM-5 product could be at risk for not being as clinically meaningful and usable as it needs to be. And as for the former," referring to the process of development, "I am reminded about what Churchill said about democracy, the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried." Yes, government, not science. We're led to believe that the development of the DSM is a product of good science, the product of transparent peer review processes and the impartial weighing up of the best evidence. No, it isn't. It has been a product of a process, but that process has not been a scientific one, more a socio-political one. The DSM-3, perhaps more than any other document, sowed the seeds of a revolution. Up until that time, psychiatric diagnosis varied enormously between Europe and the USA. At this time, psychiatry was still reeling from the Rosenhan experiments. Diagnosis was a purely subjective matter. The anti-psychiatry movement was winning, at least in the public imagination. And after the scares associated with barbiturates, benzodiazepines, and the pandemic of tardive dyskinesia associated with neuroleptics, the public was losing its appetite for pills and their faith that the so-called mental disorders were medical problems. Spitzer, the editor, was fairly public about wanting to bring the disorders under the medical umbrella. The APA faced huge resistance from psychology in characterizing psychiatric diagnoses as medical problems, hence the terminology disorder from the DSM's conception. To date, the field of psychiatry couldn't even agree on criteria for the archetypal or prototypical psychiatric problems. The DSM-3 aimed to change all that. Donald Klein, a member of the DSM-2 task force, recalls that its development was neither driven by recent scientific advances nor the triumph of biologism. In fact, etiologically based categorization was explicitly eschewed because psychogenic and biogenic theories of the time were contradictory and useless when it came to looking at large numbers of people. The development was principally driven by the methodological discovery that the psychiatric diagnostic unreliability was due to criterion variance. He says that if one was told a patient was a schizophrenic, one didn't have a clue, but one could lucidly discuss the presence or absence of delusions and hallucinations. The goals of the DSM were fairly clear. The key issues being to improve the reliability of diagnosis, and again it did this admirably. Criteria and categories of disorder were constructed by consensus in everyday colloquial descriptive language. Importantly, in this edition and in subsequent revisions and editions, it is clearly stated that no presumption that disorders have a common etiology or pathophysiological process unless it is clearly proven. And it is acknowledged that the disorders themselves typically have amorphous boundaries and that individuals diagnosed may differ in important ways that may affect clinical management and outcomes. I raise this because people have come to assume quite erroneously that these discrete categories have common causes, that these diagnoses are diseases. However, now we all say potato, and the DSM-3 became the lingua franca of psychiatry, and the criteria sets the operational definition of disorder in research around the world. Other taxonomies were created and sometimes passionately promoted. Better, more valid operational definitions for discrete disorders have also been proposed, but they really matter not a jot unless they have the endorsement of the APA task force. Later revisions merely tweaked the DSM-3, but followed the same developmental process. Robert Spitzer, the editor of the DSM-3, later criticised his own work, stating that it led to the medicalisation of 20% of the population who may not have had any serious mental health problems. This was the inadvertent cost of reliability. The cost has also been transformed into mind-boggling profits for pharmacological companies. And let's look at how. The first two editions of the DSM stressed cause or etiology of disorders, not merely the manifestation of syndrome. The depressive neuroses were considered a reaction to an internal conflict or an identifiable event. When I trained, the idea of reactive depression or depression caused by bad stuff happening, and endogenous depression, the idea that some depression has unknown or more complex causes, was simply taken to be how it was. Indeed, I note that Beyond Blue does make this distinction, and a depressive reaction caused by stresses and strains. It stands to reason, to me at least, that these different manifestations of depression probably require different approaches. Clinical depression in this era was rare, severe, and life-threatening. For mild depression, one could always take amphetamines. If you could pay, see a counsellor or psychotherapist. I'm not suggesting that people weren't corralled into institutional settings or that people weren't inappropriately placed in psych hospitals, but there wasn't the pandemic of clinical depression we have today. For this to occur, one needed to loosen the diagnostic criteria. The DSM-3 did this by removing this distinction between forms of depression based on cause, and formed the prototype of the criteria we have for major depressive disorder today. Depression became simply depression. In later iterations, the DSM-4, the DSM-4-TR, merely tweaked these criteria. The DSM-3, I suggest, had a powerful influence on conception of mental disorder internationally. Even in those countries that didn't use it explicitly, within a few years the idea that depression is depression regardless of cause took hold. The DSM-3 criteria also provided the gold standard operational definitions for mental disorder in research around the world. And within a few years we began to see trends like this from the UK, the tracking of antidepressant use in the 1980s, upwards. And of course the exponential rise in the 1990s and 2000s, associated with the popularization of the SSRIs. Depression equals antidepressant, perfect synergy. Great marketing strategy. And I would add, also a great way to subvert the scientific attitude. Doesn't matter why one is depressed. I'm sure I'm not alone in having a traumatized, conflicted young person come to me and tell me that they're not sure why they need to talk because they have a serotonin imbalance. We may not have the kind of direct marketing that people in the US or New Zealand have, in which on average people are exposed to 10 pharmaceutical advertisements a day, but the marketing of the overly simplistic, nonsensical, or demonstrably wrong biochemical imbalance theories have managed to find a large and receptive audience. And sadly it's been my experience that many nurses treat such nonsense as fact. I like to draw people's attention to tianeptine, on topic for this series of talks, a serotonin uptake enhancer at least as effective as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. I expect the irony is not lost on this audience. Not every society and culture has accepted the notion of depression as a psychiatric illness, an illness like any other, amenable to a chemical cure, like Europe, the US, Australia, and much of the English-speaking world. Indeed, many cultures have until recently resisted the cultural encroachment of Western conceptions of illness, or at least the notion that they are amenable to biological treatment. Take Japan, for example. Japan is not noted to be the most happy country on earth, and Japanese people are well acquainted with various forms of depression and suicide. Indeed, Japan has twice the rate of suicide as the US. In Japanese, the word for depression, utsubyo, traditionally referred only to major or manic depressive disorders and was seldom heard outside of psychiatric circles. It is fair to say that traditionally framing psychosocial problems as psychiatric ones carried an enormous amount of stigma. Indeed, in 2002, the Japanese Society of Psychiatry and Neurology changed the long-standing translation for schizophrenia, mind split disease, into a new term, integration disorder, in order to reduce stigma. And indeed, within 3 years, the percentage of patients actually informed of their diagnosis increased from 37 to 70%. That aside, the Japanese have lots of ways of accounting for kinds of depression. The latest, hikomori, or withdrawal, has been well covered in English press. However, for our purposes, the idea that there was a mild depression that was a medical problem was completely alien. Indeed, whilst pharmaceutical companies were making profits that would make oil barons and arms dealers envious in the late 1990s, most put Japan in the too tough to crack basket. This was an extreme marketing challenge. First, one needed a way of framing mild depression as acceptable, and then provide a cure. In doing so, undermining 1500 years of Buddhist teaching that suffering is a part of everyday life. In 1999, a Japanese company coined the phrase kokoro no kaze, the common cold of the soul. The antidote, Deprimel, an SSRI. The next year, GlaxoSmithKline entered the market, and Koji Nakagawa, their product manager for Paxil, explained, "People didn't know they were suffering from a disease. We felt it was important to reach out to them. So the company formulated a tripartite message. Depression is a disease that anyone can get. It can be cured by medicine, and early detection is important." The campaign was intense and successful. It involved a beautiful young lady, all smiles, stating, "I went to the doctor, now I'm happy." The shareholders for GlaxoSmithKline were also happy. Sales skyrocketed from next to nothing to $298 million US within 2 years, and 127 million people consulted their doctors about depression during one campaign. Some social commentators have suggested the marketing campaign went a little too well, and that maybe it should have been framed cancer of the soul. What does it matter anyway? The Japanese are getting the help they need, right? The best treatment demonstrated as effective by science? I'll leave that one to David Colquhoun, who's recently had a crack at my university. He's a member of an organisation called Friends of Science and Medicine, a group of 400 medicos and others who have made headlines in the New York Times, British Medical Journal, as well as every Murdoch-owned broadsheet in Australia. What this group states they oppose is, I quote, teaching university health courses on topics such as homeopathy, reflexology, chiropractic, iridology, etc. It contradicts the commitment of tertiary institutions to maintaining the highest educational and research standards, etc. Their oft-stated view is that alternative medicine that works is simply medicine, and medicine is the paragon of scientific virtue. And what better person to comment on the state of the science? If you ask a herbalist which of their concoctions has the best evidence of efficacy, they usually try to avoid the question, but if pushed, the answer is quite likely to be St. John's wort. They will say with pride that it's been shown to be as good as SSRIs for mild to moderate depression. Unfortunately for herbalists, as well as for patients, we now know that when hidden negative trials are included, SSRIs are themselves essentially ineffective. Professor Colquhoun was probably referring to Kirsch et al.'s meta-analysis in PLOS Medicine in 2008, which found no clinically significant difference between placebo and SSRIs in any group, but the most severely depressed. Indeed, most guidelines suggest that antidepressants shouldn't be prescribed for common cold varieties of depression. Touché, Professor Colquhoun, but maybe it's been a long time since you've done a psych or general practice rotation. Let me remind you of how scientific our practice is in Australia. In 2009, 10 to 13 million prescriptions for antidepressants were filled on the PBS scheme, or 60% of mental health spend on pharmaceuticals. $460 million worth of drugs that largely are no better than placebo. So as it stands, what does the DSM-5 revision have in store for us in relation to depression? Not much. A little bit of tweaking. The inclusion of severity indicators and the dropping of bereavement as an exclusion criteria for a major depressive episode. Wouldn't Zissuk and Kindler be as proud as punch to be so influential as to alter history with their one paper? I wrote a couple of papers directly relating to and highly critical of our college's receipt of pharmaceutical company sponsorship a few years ago, and I eagerly tuned into the great debate last year. Alas, nobody had appeared to have read my papers, which says a lot about the reach of peer-reviewed nursing journals. In this instance, these people get to change history. Oh, hang on. Actually, Kenneth Kindler is a member of the APA Mood Disorder Working Group. No wonder someone has read his paper. Indeed, he writes a further explanation of this change on the APA website. If Dr. Kindler didn't have such impeccable credentials, I'd give him, at this paper at best, a C for failure to reference sources. He says, and again this says more about the non-scientific process of developing these diagnostic categories, the grief exclusion criteria, which states that someone who has experienced a recent bereavement is not eligible for a diagnosis of major depression, was not present in the two major psychiatric diagnostic systems that form the basis for the DSM-3. The Diagnostic Manual, that is the immediate precursor of our current DSM-4. Rather, it was added to DSM-3 largely on the basis of the work of one of the DSM-3 task force members who was then studying grief and was carried forward with little modification into DSM-4. I guess we all have our hobby horses and must presume that those in the DSM-5 working group have theirs well broken in. I don't disagree with the actual change. It makes sense logically. Why would one single out bereavement as an exclusion criteria when clearly all manner of losses and traumatic events might be associated with depressive symptoms? A further issue with the DSM-5, and indeed diagnosis going back to DSM-3, is that a diagnosis says nothing about cause. One can tweak the diagnostic criteria as much as one likes, and in this instance I can't see anything particularly wrong with the tweak. However, one ought to heed Dr. Alan Francis's advice. A tiny change in wording can have unforeseen and far-reaching consequences. He states publicly his regret that changing a word or two in the DSM has triggered an epidemic of false positives as an attention deficit disorder. Also, despite the words of caution in the last 3 iterations of the DSM in the West, a cause is frequently assumed for these symptoms. Although none have been found, and not a single biomarker is proposed as a criteria in the DSM-5, the assumption is that there is some kind of biological etiology, or at the very least, that the best way of tackling the problem is biochemical. I think I've demonstrated that in relation to prescribing patterns in depression. But what about ADHD? That didn't even exist when I was growing up. The Australian rate of prescription of stimulant drugs to children, which requires a diagnosis of ADHD, has been found to be 11 times that of the United Kingdom. Within Australia there is huge variation, with WA until recently having 4 times the rate of Queensland. This is clearly related to socio-cultural factors and funding models, and this is the real significance of diagnosis. It can get you things. In the US, the kinds of services you can get are often based on diagnostic-related groupings, and in Australia this is true for many drugs and services. Even the mental health incentive program, the quasi-practice nurse funding model under which I practice, requires some loose criteria of seriousness and likelihood of hospitalisation. Every person I see defies easy classification, but I'm sure Medicare would not be happy if I was providing care for someone with a primary diagnosis of simple phobia. Thankfully, the diagnostic criteria are now so loose for bipolar type 2 that almost everyone meets criteria. And if they don't, one fail-safe way to provoke a hypomanic episode is to abruptly stop or change antidepressants. The low rate of ADHD in Queensland might paradoxically be explained by the apparently high rate of autistic spectrum disorder, which is 3 times the national average. Autistic spectrum disorder in Queensland is the pathway to obtain state-funded teacher assistance. So difficult to manage boys, or largely boys, are diagnosed with ASD in Queensland and given teaching support, and ADHD in WA and given Ritalin. A survey of child psychiatrists and paediatricians in Queensland found that 58% of respondents erred on the side of providing an autistic spectrum disorder diagnosis when faced with diagnostic uncertainty. Interestingly, the same child in France is likely to have family therapy, and there has been heated debate, largely by North American psychiatrists, about whether French kids are missing out on effective treatment. That is Ritalin. No doubt when Ritalin goes off patent, we will see a shift in the discourse. Actually, the psychopharmacology industry is in a bit of a slump. No new compounds have been discovered and come to market in the last 20 years, and almost all the ones we have are the products of serendipitous observation. Consequently, as drugs go off patent, companies desperately look for new indications and age groups. Fair play to our various partners in well-being, as we like to call our college sponsors, to target children. At least they're sensitive. Pfizer are customizing new products for children. Zoloft in a truck. Zyprexa is now indicated for pretty much everything, and the typical SSRI for every kind of anxiety, gradation of depression, compulsion, or any degree of obsessiveness. One might as well just drop SSRIs in the water like fluoride. There is absolutely no doubt that some of these drugs have effects, even good effects, uppers and downers, exciters and suppressors. However, none can be said to really treat any disease. Joanna Moncrief, psychiatrist and author of The Myth of the Chemical Cure, has suggested we should drop the pretense of disease-focused drug treatment and just consider the effects of drugs. However, for now, the heuristic create syndrome, talk up the seriousness and prevalence of it, encourage off-label prescribing, seek legitimacy through inclusion in the diagnostic formulary, identify a target symptom or two, and market a drug to treat it is the usual process of development. The FDA actually pulled approval on this particular ad campaign. After such great success in Japan, our old friends from GSK rebranded paroxetine for social phobia or generalized anxiety disorder. Imagine being allergic to people. Apparently over 1/3 of Americans suffer from pathological shyness. Sadly, none that I've ever sat next to on a long-haul bus trip. But maybe they were taking Paxil. Despite the campaign being pulled, it became the world's top-selling antidepressant with close to $5 billion in global sales in 2003. Where was GAD when I was growing up? I was a bit of a wallflower and had to make do with alcohol and street drugs. ADHD didn't exist either, but you'll be pleased to know that adult ADHD is likely to gain legitimacy with the DSM-5, so adults can at least get their amphetamines on prescription again. I am certainly part of the Prozac generation, but since this went off patent, it's hardly the drug of choice anymore. But there is good news for the ladies in the audience. You thought it was just PMS. It could be premenstrual dysphoric disorder. This rare and serious disease with at least 2 million sufferers in the US is set to be made legitimate in the DSM-5. It merely made an appendix in the DSM-4, not a real disease, but in this iteration it will be given full-blown disorder status. Lilly tried it on in the US, but the license was withdrawn in 2003. A committee of the European Agency for the Evaluation of Medicinal Products in London concluded that PMDD is not a well-established disease entity across Europe. No such problem now, apparently. In a couple of page press statement, not a robust peer review process, the PMDD will be voted in and women all around the world will be able to get 10 milligrams of Prozac on various socialized drug formularies. The DSM is a powerful and social cultural influence. It shapes both public health and professionals' perceptions of what counts as psychiatric within the purview of health and welfare services. Even Thomas Saz, the most famous critic of the concept of mental illness, as an invited commentator in the Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry bulletin devoted to the DSM-5, conceded that diagnoses are here to stay. He says, medicalization, epitomized by psychiatry, is the foundation stone of our modern, secular, statist ideology, manifested by the therapeutic state. The DSM, though patently absurd, has become an utterly indispensable legal social tool. Ideologies supported by common consent, church, state and tradition are social facts or truths. As such, they are virtually impervious to criticism and possess very long lives. The DSM is here to stay, and so is the intellectual and moral morass in which psychiatry has entwined itself and the modern mind. The DSM is hard to criticise, except for the consequences that arise from it, or the use to which it is put. I suggest that the error of presuming we are talking about real diseases with known etiologies, rather than convenient clusters of symptoms, poses real problems. Only a few days ago, a woman I'd been seeing for therapy with an incredibly complex history, and a chronically dysthymic mood, was refused a disability pension by Centrelink. I don't think anyone would dispute that she meets criteria for major depression, amongst other things. She was told that she was not eligible for a pension because she refused to take an antidepressant, apparently the known treatment for her disorder, depression. That people jump to these conclusions based on diagnosis is hardly the fault of the manuals themselves. That this lady meets criteria for depression, as it stands, is not really contestable. One can't argue with that, but one can ask what it means. Sorborough, in 2010, suggests that a problem with the DSM, being purely descriptive, atheoretical, and untied to any verifiable pathology, is that it's not even wrong, that it is based on assumptions that can't possibly be falsified or used to predict anything. One can speculate about what might have caused someone to feel depressed, but one cannot prove that an entity is depression. Mental illness might be considered a fiction in the same sense that Spinoza used the term, an idea created out of other ideas. As such, it can't possibly be proved wrong. A catalogue of symptoms or symptom lists cannot be proved wrong, although it's entirely possible to project all manner of patently wrong theories and interventions on people so categorized. John Giardini this year called psychiatric diagnoses unexplanations. That is, they don't just fail to explain, they stand in the way of authentic understanding. Mental illness, like many of the concepts employed through common language in mental health services, are like religious concepts, in that they are neither true nor false. It is a conception based on experience and provides a way to structure experience and to decide how to live our lives. I argued a few years ago when Queensland Health introduced their so-called outcome measurement protocols, similar to MOAT in New South Wales, that forcing people to tender a diagnosis from the moment of entry into psychiatric care was antithetical to good practice. The issue was not could a diagnosis be made, but should one be made. This was a particular concern to me at the time, as I was seeing some people for psychotherapy, and diagnosis forced us into a frame which was positively unhelpful. I did a presentation at the Far North Queensland sub-branch of the college expressing some of my concerns, and amazingly I was contacted the following Monday by a nice lady from Brisbane offering to re-educate me about the protocols and how good they were for me and my patients. She stated that every health professional ought to base their practice on diagnosis. I asked when was the last time she practiced, because anyone in practice, or at least anybody that is really experienced in practice, knows that when working with individual, one needs to find the best working formulation that explains a person's problems and suggests the best means to help them. I still maintain this. Clearly, we don't have time to discuss solutions to the problems of diagnosis. That's another session. I would argue, however, that clinicians need above all else to develop idiographic formulations. Clinicians are not concerned with how this patient is like others, except in as much as that might help to explain their problems. Diagnosis doesn't tend to do this. It is what it is, a description. Problem or case formulation arises out of and demonstrates an understanding of the individual. This old concept, which predates even DSM-1, is having something of a renaissance at present. In summary, this revision of the DSM is highly significant because it shapes our collective understanding of disorder. It serves to legitimate medical treatments for particular problems, and thus is a tool by which the pharmaceutical industry can extend its influence. Asperger's today, autistic spectrum disorder tomorrow. Some disorders will be voted in, and some will have life breathed into them with this iteration. This will have enormous ramifications for particular groups who rely on diagnoses to obtain specific services. Even small changes have been proven to have enormous unintended consequences. We can expect that the pharmaceutical industry will seek ways to extend their reach and influence whatever changes are made. The DSM is not a product of good science, and the process of its development does not reflect good science. It is what it is, and will continue to fulfill its perfectly reasonable aims of enabling us to talk with some degree of reliability about symptoms and syndromes. This is at the expense of validity. We are not talking about diseases. But as long as we pursue attempts to understand individuals rather than merely categorizing their symptoms, then we might attenuate some of the negative unintended consequences of diagnosis. Meanwhile, one can visit the APA site and peruse the stream of proposed changes, but like a release of an iPhone, one won't really know what's inside until the day of release. Thank you.